It doesn't begin with cruelty. It begins with charm. They walk into your life with a spark in their smile, a flicker of pain in their eyes, and a story that seems half told, like they've been waiting for someone just like you to finish it. They're witty, magnetic, maybe a little mysterious. You feel seen, special, chosen. But beneath that instant connection, something ancient is stirring. Carl Jung called it the persona, the carefully crafted mask we were to survive in a world that doesn't always welcome our truth. And here's where the trap begins, for the empath sees that mask and mistakes it for the soul. You don't just fall for who they are. You fall for who they could become, if only someone loved them right. If only someone stayed. You see the cracks in their armor and imagine their invitations. But they're not. They're warnings. Jung described the persona as a system of behavior that is adopted in response to the expectations of others. It's not the real self. It's camouflage, a survival strategy. And yet, empaths, with their boundless compassion and deep emotional intuition, often confuse the mask for a message. You think they're not cold, they're guarded. They're not selfish, they're scared. So you lean in, offer more, love harder. Let's take Maya, for example. She was a brilliant teacher, gentle, intuitive, adored by her students. She met Ethan at a fundraiser. He was charismatic, a little awkward, full of dreams and half-finished stories. He spoke about heartbreak like it was an old friend. Maya felt drawn to him, not just romantically, but spiritually. She believed she saw his soul. But over time, that soul became more elusive. He was emotionally distant, dismissive, but always just vulnerable enough to keep her hoping. She called it chemistry. But it was a loop. He needed someone to believe in his mask, and she needed someone to redeem. She mistook his detachment for depth, his avoidance for mystery, his pain for honesty. The truth was, Ethan never removed the mask. He just wore one that looked like someone who might heal. And that's the first trap. Because when you love the mask, you ignore the man. This is where dramatic irony pierces the heart of the empath's journey. While you're giving your energy to someone you believe is broken but beautiful, they're unconsciously using your love to sustain the very persona they have no intention of shedding. They may not mean to deceive, but their entire identity is stitched together by the need to be admired without being known. The empath's tragedy is not in being fooled. It's in being willing to be fooled. You want so badly to believe there's something real underneath that you hand over your heart as proof. If I love them hard enough, you think they'll take off the mask, but they won't, because for them, the mask is the self. And here's where Jung's wisdom cuts deep. The persona is a system of behavior that is adopted in response to the expectations of others. The person you fell for was never real. It was a performance, one shaped by their past, their wounds, and their refusal to be vulnerable. You weren't in love with a man. You were in love with the mask he used to survive. You can't love someone's persona into becoming their soul. And the longer you try, the further you drift from your own. Comment if you've ever mistaken someone's mask for their true heart. It doesn't feel like a choice, it feels like gravity. You meet someone, and before you know it, you're pulled in. Not by logic, not by compatibility, but by something else, something deeper, older, ancient even. You tell yourself, I just feel connected, as if the universe whispered their name into your bones. But this isn't fate. Not yet. What you're feeling is a projection, a psychological mirror, not a soulmate. Carl Jung described projection as the unconscious act of casting our own unacknowledged qualities onto another. And empaths are especially prone to this. Why? Because you love deeply. You feel fully. So fully, in fact, that your own love becomes the lens through which you see others. You think you're seeing them clearly. But what you're really seeing is yourself. That's the trick. You're not drawn to who they are. You're drawn to who you are when you're with them. The warmth you feel, it's your own warmth bouncing back. The depth you sense in them, it's your own depth reflected. And the hope you carry, it isn't about their potential. It's about your longing for someone to love you like you love them. But here's where the story turns. The stronger your love, the stronger the illusion. Take Elise, for example. A teacher, Empathic, always the one to notice who needed help in the room. She met Daniel at a school fundraiser, quiet, wounded eyes, a charming smile that never reached his soul. Elise saw sadness in him and instantly felt a pull. He's just guarded, she thought. Maybe I can help. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't just seeing Daniel. She was seeing the part of herself that wanted to rescue the distant, unreachable father from her childhood. Daniel's aloofness felt familiar. Her projection made it feel intimate. She wasn't falling for Daniel. She was falling for the story she needed to complete. Dramatic irony lives in this kind of bond. Because while you're moving closer, trying to fix or understand them, they're pulling away, unsure why your love feels so overwhelming. And the more they retreat, the more you lean in. Not because they've earned that closeness, but because you've confused empathy with connection and hope with truth. You say things like, maybe he's scared of love, or maybe if I stay patient, she'll come around. But underneath that hope is fear that if this isn't real, you'll have to face your own unmet need for love. Jung warned of this cycle when he wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This isn't destiny. It's a loop, a mirror showing you the parts of yourself still hungry for closure, validation, and reciprocity. And until you recognize that what you're chasing is your own reflection, the cycle will continue. Because the bond you feel, it's not mutual. It's a projection loop. Have you seen your own mask slip under pressure? They don't look like danger. That's what makes it so dangerous. They appear quiet, thoughtful, maybe even broken in a way that tugs at your heart. Not loud like a villain, not cruel like a tyrant, just wounded. And for an empath, that's enough. That's the bait. Because there's a certain kind of pain that calls to you like an echo from somewhere deep in your past. Jung said, "We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become. But the truth is what happened to us still chooses for us until we wake up." The people we're drawn to aren't always random. They are mirrors. And often, they are magnets for a part of us still trying to resolve the unresolved. Take Mira, for example. She was a high-performing nurse, empathetic, intuitive, always present for others. But in relationships, she kept falling for the same kind of man. Distant, emotionally absent, quietly volatile. Her last partner, Daniel, was a textbook case. On their first date, he talked about his traumatic childhood, his estranged father, how he never learned what love really meant. Mira leaned in, not away. She felt needed, special. "He trusts me," she told her friends. But what she didn't see was that she wasn't falling for who he was. She was falling for who she hoped he could become with her love. That's the reenactment. Carl Jung believed that we are drawn to people who carry our shadow, the parts of ourselves we've disowned. If you had to fight for love as a child, you might now find yourself fighting for love again as an adult, but calling it romance instead of repetition. If you were taught that your needs were too much, you might find yourself with someone who keeps you small and silent, mistaking that familiarity for fate. It's not fate. It's unfinished business. The emotional pull feels intense because it's primal. That person's wound looks like yours. So you try to heal them. You try to pour love into a void that was never yours to fill. You think, if I can just love them enough, maybe they'll choose me. Maybe this time, love will stay. But that's not love. That's the shadow performing a script. And the tragedy is that while you're trying to rescue them, you're actually abandoning yourself. The dramatic irony is brutal. Because the more you give, the more you lose. The more you hope, the more you hurt. They didn't ask you to fix them, but you thought that if you could, maybe it would fix something inside you. That's the unspoken truth most empaths live with. This isn't about the other person. This is about you trying to make sense of the pain you couldn't understand when you were too young to name it. Eventually, Mira saw it. Not all at once, but one night, after another silent dinner, another cold shoulder, another night spent crying in the bathroom while he watched TV, she heard her younger self in her head whisper, "This feels familiar." That whisper became a roar. And for the first time, she didn't reach for him. She reached for herself. The allure of the wounded isn't love. It's a test, a repetition, a wound reenacting itself until you finally notice it's bleeding through every part of your life. Jung said, We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. The trick is to recognize the disguise and choose to stop the cycle. You love them because part of you believes if they finally love you back, you'll finally be worthy. That's not love. That's a reenactment. And you'll keep replaying the same pattern until you realize it's not about them. It never was. Comment if you've ever been drawn to someone's pain instead of their presence. Some people leave when they're mistreated. Empaths often stay and call it love. It doesn't begin with manipulation. It begins with compassion. You see someone hurting, and your instinct is to understand, to soothe, to carry what they can't. But what starts as care slowly mutates. You begin to tolerate cold silences, disrespectful words, broken promises. You tell yourself, they've just had a hard life. You start explaining away the very behaviors that are eroding your peace. Jung would say this is the moment when the persona, the mask you wear, starts to fracture, because your outer smile is no longer matching your inner ache. You say you're fine, but your heart is bleeding loyalty for someone who wouldn't crawl an inch if your world was on fire. This is the shadow side of empathy, where selflessness turns to self-abandonment. Jung taught that what we repress becomes the shadow. And for many empaths, their needs, their voices, their boundaries are the first to be buried. Why? Because you've learned to survive by making others feel safe. Somewhere in your past, maybe childhood, you were taught that love is something you earn, not something you receive by right. And so when someone treats you poorly, you don't leave. You work harder. You love more. You convince yourself they're just scared, or healing, or misunderstood. Because if they change, if they finally choose you, then maybe you'll be worthy. But that's not love. That's penance. I once knew a woman named Claire, a gifted artist and a deeply intuitive empath. She fell in love with a man who was brilliant, charismatic, but emotionally unavailable. For years, she excused his emotional distance, his cruel remarks, even his infidelity, because she saw potential. He could be kind. He could be vulnerable. He just wasn't ready. She painted pictures of the man he might become and clung to those images like lifelines. But in the process, she stopped painting for herself. Her art withered. Her joy vanished. She became a shadow of the woman she used to be, loyal to a ghost, faithful to a future that never arrived. And when he finally left, her first thought wasn't anger. It was guilt. Maybe I didn't love him well enough. That's the cruelest twist of empathic loyalty. You blame yourself for someone else's refusal to grow. You carry their wounds like medals of devotion. But what you're really doing is disappearing. You're molding yourself around their dysfunction, shrinking to fit their comfort zones, bending over backward just to keep their attention while they offer you crumbs. And still you stay. Not because you're weak, but because somewhere deep inside, you're terrified that walking away means you never mattered at all. But here's the truth Jung would want you to face. Your empathy is not supposed to be a leash. It is not supposed to tether you to people who drain you. True empathy includes yourself, self-compassion, self-recognition. And if your loyalty costs you your peace, it's not love, it's a trauma response. Because when you're more loyal to someone's potential than their reality, you're no longer in a relationship. You're in a story you've written, starring someone who doesn't exist. There's dramatic irony here. The more you defend them, the more you disappear. The more you hope they'll change, the more you postpone the healing that should begin with you. You stay not for them, but for the person you wish they were. That's the emotional mirage of empathic loyalty. It keeps you wandering in deserts of denial, thirsty for a love that can't be poured from someone who's still drinking from their own poison. And here's the most painful truth of all. They might never become the version you believe in, and staying won't make them. But leaving, reclaiming your worth, your voice, your truth, just might save you. Empaths don't fall out of love easily. Even when the other person withdraws, disrespects, or manipulates, you find yourself defending them. Why? Because you've made their pain your responsibility. You've confused love with duty. You might say, they've been through a lot, or they don't know how to love. But underneath those excuses is something deeper, fear. Fear that if you stop giving, you'll stop matching. This is the shadow of empathy, where compassion turns into self-abandonment. Jung taught that what we deny in ourselves becomes the shadow, and many empaths have denied their own needs for so long they don't even recognize neglect when it happens. You become loyal to their potential, not their reality. You stay because the dream of who they could be feels more real than the pain of who they actually are. Empathy becomes dangerous when it makes you disappear. They will not become the person you hoped they'd grow into, and the sooner you accept that, the freer you become. There's a cruel kind of silence that follows when you finally realize the one you poured into, waited for, and loved unconditionally is never going to meet you there. It's not because you didn't try hard enough. It's not because you lack patience or loyalty. It's because they were never trying to become the kind of person you already are. That's the truth so many empaths choke on, because admitting it means letting go of the dream you built around them. A dream where they'd wake up, change, choose you back. But that dream was yours alone. Carl Jung called this awakening individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are by integrating the parts of yourself you once exiled in the name of love. For empaths, the parts that get exiled are usually the most essential. Your right to be seen. Your right to be valued. Your right to be loved in return, not just admired for how much you can give without asking for anything back. Consider a man named Ethan. For years, he poured himself into a relationship with someone who only loved him in moments, on good days, when they weren't triggered or distant or cold. He waited through seasons of silence, justifying it as space, forgiving betrayal as trauma, and lowering his voice just to keep the peace. He believed, deep down, that his love could guide them into becoming better. But time didn't bring transformation. It only revealed that Ethan was the only one evolving. One night, after another broken promise, Ethan stood in the bathroom mirror and whispered the one truth he had always avoided. I'm becoming less of myself to keep someone who never wanted all of me. That moment broke him, but also began to rebuild him. Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. But the empath's wound is different. They'll do anything to help others face theirs, while avoiding their own in the process. That's where the healing begins, not in fixing others, but in reclaiming what you buried to feel worthy, your needs, your voice, your boundaries. This isn't about becoming hard. It's about becoming whole. You stop seeing others through the lens of what they could be and start seeing them clearly for who they choose to be. And more importantly, you start seeing yourself again, not just as a healer or a giver, but as a person worthy of reciprocity. You stop chasing their evolution and begin your own, not with rage, but with clarity, not with coldness, but with sovereignty. You learn to say, I can love deeply, but I will no longer offer it where it's not returned. That decision is the first step out of the cycle, the first crack in the illusion, the first breath of freedom. Because rescuing others won't rescue you, but rescuing yourself? That's where the Real story begins. They couldn't love you the way you love them, because they were never trying to become the kind of person you already are. It's a strange kind of heartbreak to realize you've spent years helping others just to avoid helping yourself. It doesn't look like avoidance at first. On the surface, you seem generous, warm, dependable, always ready with advice, always the first to drop everything and show up when someone else is hurting. And they thank you, lean on you, even praise your strength. But beneath all that outward goodness is a truth most empaths don't want to face. Helping them was easier than facing yourself. Carl Jung warned us about this trap. He called it the defense of the persona, the socially approved mask we wear to hide what we're not ready to confront. And for empaths, that mask often looks like kindness. Endless, boundless kindness. If I'm good enough to others, the unconscious mind whispers, I won't have to deal with how empty I feel inside. But healing doesn't work that way. Not real healing. Take Leaf, for example. Everyone called him the fixer. At work, he carried the emotional weight of his team. At home, he was the one checking in on his siblings, covering for his father's failures, making sure his partner always felt supported. But he never talked about his own pain, about the mother who left without a word, about the years he spent feeling invisible. Instead, he drowned himself in usefulness. He didn't realize it, but his empathy had become a shield. The more he helped others, the more he could postpone confronting his own grief. That grief, abandoned, silent, sat just beneath his smile, growing louder every year. There's a cruel irony in this. Every time you pour yourself into someone who refuses to grow, you delay your own growth. Every time you save someone who isn't ready to be saved, you're really postponing your own rescue. Jung once said, "You cannot transcend what you do not know. To gain self-knowledge, you must turn inward. But turning inward is hard when you're constantly focused outward. You start mistaking exhaustion for devotion, emotional depletion for generosity. And the emptier you get, the more you feel like you're doing something noble. But you're not. You're disappearing. You walk home after giving someone your last bit of energy, and no one asks how you're doing. You cry in the shower, and no one knows you even had a hard day. You're the strong one, after all, the reliable one. But who shows up for you? More importantly, why aren't you showing up for yourself? This is the hidden cost of unconscious empathy. You build others while shrinking yourself. And the world doesn't warn you, because the world benefits from people like you staying small and silent. From empaths pouring themselves out for people who never ask if they're okay. So you keep giving, thinking it's loyalty. But more often, it's fear that if you stop being useful, you'll stop being loved. It's not love if it costs you your soul. It's not kindness if it leaves you bleeding behind a smile. Jung would call this the beginning of shadow work. The moment you realize that your persona, your goodness, was hiding the parts of you that are tired, lonely, unhealed, you begin to see how compassion became a disguise, how service became self-erasure. And when you finally admit it, the grief is enormous. But so is the relief. Because now, at last, you know the truth. Helping them was never the answer. Helping you is. You cannot keep saving people as a way to avoid saving yourself. Because in the end, all that silent martyrdom leads to one thing: vanishing behind your own good intentions. Sometimes we call it loyalty, but it's just fear dressed in kindness. It starts with a sentence that feels like hope, but is actually a cage. One day, they'll understand me. You whisper it in the quiet moments. After they pull away again. After they dismiss your feelings. You clutch it like a lifeline, this idea that maybe they're just not ready yet. Maybe they need time. Maybe one day they'll wake up, realize how deeply you've loved them, and rise to meet you there. But this is where the most dangerous illusion lives. Not in what's happening, but in what you desperately wish will happen. Carl Jung warned us of the psyche's ability to attach not to reality, but to archetypes, universal patterns our unconscious mind is drawn to. And empaths, with their deep emotional range, are especially vulnerable to this trap. You're not just loving them. You're loving the wounded hero, the lost soul, the misunderstood genius. You tell yourself their coldness is mystery. Their distance is depth. Their avoidance? Just a symptom of past pain. But these aren't truths. They're projections, reflections of your own capacity to love being cast onto someone who never asked to hold them. Take Mara, for example, a school counselor with a gentle voice and a heart that bent toward broken people. She fell for Adrian, a man with sharp intellect and an emptier gaze. He'd disappear for days, then reappear with an apology that felt poetic. He spoke of trauma, of betrayal, of battles with himself. And Mara, the empath, believed her love could help him heal. Every time he pulled away, she said, "He just needs more time. One day, he'll feel safe with me." But 5 years passed, and one day never came. The truth? Adrian wasn't on a journey. Mara was, and she had mistaken standing still beside him as progress. She wasn't loving a man. She was loving the fantasy that he would change. Here's the irony. The longer you wait for someone to meet you at your level, the more you postpone your own ascent. You dim your light, soften your needs, shrink your voice, all to fit inside a waiting room that was never meant to be your home. And this is where Jung's wisdom cuts deep. He said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because when you do, you can no longer pretend that breadcrumbs are a feast. You can no longer stay in relationships that run on potential. You start to see clearly, and what you see might break your heart, because one day isn't coming. Not because you're unworthy, but because they're not becoming. You're the one evolving, questioning, yearning. They're surviving, floating, repeating. And every minute you wait for someone else to change is a minute you delay becoming who you were meant to be. The real fear is not losing them. It's realizing you've been losing yourself the whole time. So ask yourself honestly, are you in love with a person or with a someday that never arrives? Because they were never becoming someone better. You were just becoming someone smaller. It doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives in silence. Maybe you're lying awake next to someone who once lit up your whole world. Maybe you're scrolling through old messages, looking for a sign it was ever real. And then it hits you, not like thunder, but like cold water in the chest. They never loved me the way I love them. And suddenly, every smile, every excuse, every late-night tear makes sense. Not because you were unworthy, but because they were never capable. This is the moment empaths dread most, not heartbreak, but clarity. The kind of clarity that rearranges the way you see the entire past. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But sometimes there is no transformation, only confusion, only pain, only one person doing the emotional labor while the other remains unchanged." That's not a reaction. That's erosion. The truth is, many relationships aren't between two whole people. They're between two wounds, two unresolved patterns. Jung called these complexes clusters of emotional energy formed by early experiences, especially the ones we never processed. When your unresolved longing for love meets someone's unresolved fear of intimacy, it doesn't create harmony. It creates survival chemistry. You mistake tension for passion. You confuse the rush of anxiety with the thrill of love. And so you stay, not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. Consider Ava, a woman who spent years in a relationship with a man named Jordan. He was magnetic, distant, and emotionally unpredictable. Every time Ava opened her heart, Jordan pulled away. Every time she pulled back, he returned with just enough warmth to reignite hope. This wasn't a relationship. It was an emotional slot machine. And still, Ava stayed. Why? Because deep down, she believed that if she could just love him hard enough, she'd win. She wasn't chasing love. She was chasing proof that she was enough. But proof never came. And in that quiet moment, the one you may know too well, she realized she'd handed Jordan the map to her soul, and he never even tried to read it. This is the moment of individuation Jung spoke of, the beginning of becoming your true self. Not the version of you that bends, shrinks, and pleads, but the version who sees clearly, who understands that love without reciprocity isn't noble, it's self-abandonment. And that clarity is painful, because you're not just grieving a person, you're grieving the illusion you built around them. That maybe one day, that if I just love enough, I see their potential. You gave affection, they gave avoidance. You offered truth, they offered silence. You asked for partnership, they gave performance. And in the end, you were never met. You were mirrored, only enough to keep your hopes alive, never enough to build something real. But here's the gift inside the wreckage. Once the illusion dies, so does the need to prove your worth to the wrong people. You stop romanticizing chaos. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop explaining why your love deserves a place to land. And in that sacred stillness, something else rises, peace. Not because they changed, but because you did. You stop needing closure because you become the closure. You stop waiting for the apology because you already understand the truth. And that's when the real healing begins, not when they come back, but when you stop going back to the parts of yourself that accepted so little. Comment if you've ever mistaken survival chemistry for real connection. It wasn't love. It was a mirror you mistook for a doorway. It hits you on an ordinary day, not with a bang, not with tears, but with stillness. A strange, quiet clarity. You're not angry anymore. You're not even waiting. You're just done, not in a bitter way, but in the way someone finally sets down a suitcase they've been dragging through a desert, thinking there was water just ahead. You see it now. The mirage wasn't them. It was you. Carl Jung said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a part of the self, but by integration." And this is where it begins, not when they wake up, but when you do. When you stop needing them to change. When you stop hoping they'll see what you gave. When you stop performing the painful acrobatics of love, twisting yourself into someone more understanding, more patient, more silent, just to earn crumbs of affection that should have come freely. You don't need them to grow anymore. You're the one who is growing. Here's the truth no one says out loud. Most of the time, you weren't even chasing them. You were chasing the version of you that didn't feel worthy unless someone difficult finally said, "You matter." The child who thought love had to be earned. Who was told, in subtle or violent ways, that love only comes after sacrifice, silence, or suffering. And so, you became a master of all three. You silenced your needs. You sacrificed your dreams. You suffered in hope that one day they would change, and with that change, prove you were enough all along. But they didn't, because they couldn't. And somewhere deep down, you knew. Let's make it real with a story. Take Elena, a 35-year-old consultant, sharp, kind, and deeply loyal. She fell for Thomas, a brooding artist who claimed he couldn't love deeply because he was still healing. For 3 years, she waited. She encouraged. She dimmed her light whenever he felt overwhelmed. When he disappeared, she told herself he just needed space. When he lied, she told herself he was scared. When he withheld love, she gave more. Everyone said she deserved better, but she stayed because she wasn't just holding on to him. She was holding on to the hope that if he finally chose her, all the unchosen parts of her past would finally feel chosen too. But one afternoon, he forgot her birthday. No drama. No excuse. Just forgot. And something inside her didn't shatter. It clicked. She saw it clearly. I made his growth my prison. That's the breaking point empaths rarely speak of. The moment you realize you've built an entire emotional world around someone who never planned to meet you there. And now, you don't need them to climb the ladder of self-awareness. You're climbing out of the well of your own silence. Jung called this integration, the reunion of all the parts of you that you once abandoned to be loved. It's not just healing, it's retrieval. You retrieve your voice, your self-respect, your right to not explain your worth to someone who never saw it. And as you reclaim yourself, something surprising happens. The questions that haunted you, why didn't they love me? What could I have done differently? Begin to fade. Not because you got answers, but because you no longer need them. You were never waiting for closure. You were waiting for courage. And now you have it. So you walk away, not because you're heartless, but because you've finally found your heart. You stop fighting for someone's transformation and begin your own. You stop orbiting someone's potential and return to your purpose. And the moment you do, the weight you've carried for years, the ache of confusion, the hunger for validation, the desperation to be seen, becomes something else, clarity. You were never too much. You were just with someone who gave too little. So you let go, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Not because you gave up on them, but because you chose to stop giving up on yourself. And that is the real healing, not their apology, your awakening. Have you ever found peace, not through their apology, but your awakening? You stopped chasing their growth and started becoming your own. Let me know when you're ready for the next expansion. Sometimes the reason they pulled away had nothing to do with your love and everything to do with what your love revealed. This is the truth most empaths stumble into the hard way. The people who couldn't love you back weren't just unwilling, they were afraid. Afraid of what your presence mirrored. Afraid of what your tenderness touched. Carl Jung called this hidden terrain the shadow, the part of the psyche where shame, fear, inadequacy, and rage are buried beneath layers of silence and denial. And the more deeply a person has buried their shadow, the more violently they'll resist anything that tries to illuminate it. Think of Mara, a thoughtful therapist in her 30s. When she met Daniel, a sharp-tongued startup founder, she was drawn to the wounded softness behind his sarcasm. He told her early on, people always leave. She thought she'd be different. She believed love could be his redemption. But each time she got closer, when she showed consistent affection, asked about his childhood, or simply sat with him in silence, he flinched. He snapped. He vanished for days. She thought she was doing something wrong. In reality, her empathy was unraveling a defense system he'd spent years building. Her kindness wasn't soothing to him. It was threatening, because it saw him, and he had spent his whole life hiding. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." The irony is heartbreaking. While you were trying to love them, they were trying to protect themselves from you. Or more precisely, for what you represented. Because love, true, steady, reflective love, isn't just beautiful. It's confrontational. It brings up everything unhealed. And when someone hasn't made peace with their inner wounds, your presence feels like exposure. So they retreat behind arrogance, or coldness, or cruelty. And you, the empath, mistake this retreat for rejection. You try harder. You give more. You touch their pain with softer hands. But nothing works, because the battle was never about you. It was inside them. You weren't too much. You were too close to what they've always avoided. And in that, you became a mirror they couldn't face. Because to look at you clearly would mean looking at themselves without armor. And not everyone is ready for that kind of truth. And this is where your deepest heartbreak lies. Not in the fact that they left, but in knowing they didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because they couldn't stand the reflection. You try to hold them with no judgment, to love their shadow into wholeness. But here's the tragic boundary. You cannot love someone into self-awareness. You can't reach someone who is still defending the very thing that's destroying them. So remember this. The next time someone recoils from your presence, your depth, your truth, it might not be because you're wrong for them. It might be because you're real. And realness requires a reckoning they're not ready for. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You didn't trigger their love. You triggered their fear. And the more you offered tenderness, the more they recoiled. Not because of you, but because they saw a mirror where they'd rather see a wall. You weren't too much. You were just too real for someone hiding in their own shadow. Not everyone wants to be saved, and some would rather drown than face the pain of learning to swim. That's the hard truth empaths must eventually face. It's not that your love wasn't powerful, or that your intentions weren't pure. It's that healing, real healing, is terrifying. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And pain is exactly what the people you try to help are running from. Healing asks something enormous, that we descend into the very places we've spent our whole lives avoiding, the shadow, the unconscious, the traumas we've buried. It demands vulnerability, apology, effort, change. And while empaths are often willing to pay that price for others, not everyone is willing to pay it for themselves. Take Mira, for example. She loved a man who carried his childhood like a ghost on his back. Absent father, hardened mother, years of emotional survival cloaked in charisma and humor. On the outside, he was magnetic. But every time she tried to get closer, he pushed her away. If she cried, he mocked her. If she stayed silent, he accused her of distance. It became a dance of confusion. She told herself, he just needs time. But deep down, she was hoping love could coax out the man she believed lived beneath the armor. But the armor wasn't coming off. Because for him, the armor was the man. What she didn't realize, what many empaths miss, is that love, by its very nature, threatens people who aren't ready to confront their shadows. When you show someone unconditional presence, when you reflect their pain with compassion, it forces them to look at parts of themselves they've spent decades suppressing. And some people will do anything to avoid that. They'll gaslight you, sabotage the relationship, turn cold, defensive, cruel. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right. Because you saw too much. Your light became a mirror, and they weren't ready to see their reflection. Jung explained this in his concept of the shadow, the hidden, disowned self that contains all the parts we repress: shame, guilt, insecurity, fear. Most people would rather double down on their personas, their public masks, than risk cracking that shell open. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls, he wrote. And so, while you offered growth, they chose stagnation. While you reached out, they recoiled. While you spoke truth, they clung to the comfort of denial. This is the moment that breaks so many empaths. You give everything, your energy, your love, your belief in their potential, and still they do not change. But the heartbreak isn't just about rejection. It's about realizing that no matter how pure your love was, you cannot choose healing for someone who refuses to choose it for themselves. And here lies the tragic irony. The more you love someone unwilling to grow, the more they resent you for making their stillness feel like a choice. You become the lighthouse, and they close their eyes. Because seeing your light would mean facing their darkness. It would mean taking responsibility. And for some, that's more terrifying than losing you. So they don't transform. Not because you weren't enough, but because they never intended to. And in that quiet, painful realization, a deeper clarity emerges. You were never the reason they stayed broken. You were just the reason they couldn't pretend they weren't. They didn't fail to change because you were enough. They failed to change because they never intended to. Next, the lie you believed about being too hard to love. What if the problem was never that you were too much, but that they were never ready for something real? It's one of the cruelest illusions empaths fall into. The belief that they are difficult to love. It doesn't start loudly. It whispers. In the silence after a message is ignored. In the emptiness after giving your all and receiving nothing. In the look they gave you right before they pulled away. And over time, that whisper becomes a question. Maybe I was too hard to love. But this question isn't born from truth. It's born from projection. Jung warned us that we often carry the weight of other people's shadows, mistaking them for our own flaws. You weren't too much. You were too true. And they didn't reject you because of your truth. They rejected you because they were never taught how to hold something that honest without fear. Receiving love sounds easy, but for many, it's terrifying. To accept love, real love, means confronting every hidden belief that says you're not worthy of it. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And love, the real kind, doesn't just touch the heart, it touches the soul. So when you showed up with open arms and an open heart, they didn't see a safe place. They saw a mirror, a reflection of everything they hadn't yet faced. And instead of receiving your love, they ran from it, mocked it, minimized it, or pushed it away with coldness they called boundaries and distance they called space. Let me tell you a story. A friend of mine, Layla, dated a man who claimed to want depth. He praised vulnerability, asked philosophical questions, spoke in the language of healing and growth. And for a while, Layla believed him. She showed him her softness. She didn't hide her fears or her past. She listened. She supported. She loved. But the closer she got, the more he withdrew. He'd change the subject when she cried. He'd say she was too intense when she expressed her needs. Eventually, he left with no explanation, just a vague statement about needing more space to find himself. Months later, he was with someone emotionally unavailable, living a smaller, simpler version of life. It wasn't until Layla did her own inner work that she saw the truth. He didn't reject her. He rejected the invitation her love extended, the invitation to grow, to face himself, to step into a version of life that required courage. His silence wasn't proof that she was too much. It was proof that he wasn't ready. Jung explained that our reactions to others often reveal more about ourselves than them. If someone recoils from love, it's because love threatens the part of them still rooted in fear. And many people would rather remain in the safety of emotional numbness than risk being seen completely. You weren't wrong to love them. You were just too real for someone still hiding behind their shadow. Your tenderness uncovered the parts of them they weren't ready to accept. And so they ran. From you, yes, but more truthfully from themselves. And here's the hardest part to accept. There was nothing you could have done differently. You could have loved more gently. You could have given less, given more. You could have stayed quiet, spoken louder, waited longer. But it wouldn't have changed the outcome. Because this was never about your capacity to love. It was about their capacity to receive. Your love wasn't the problem. Your truth wasn't too heavy. Your presence wasn't too much. In fact, your love might have been the most honest thing they ever experienced. And that's why it terrified them. Because receiving that kind of love means admitting you deserve it. And some people, deep down, don't believe they do. So instead of doubting your heart, let it become your evidence. Proof that you can feel deeply, that you can love without games, that you offer something real in a world full of masks and defenses, that you deserve connection that meets you, not connection you have to shrink yourself for. This pain didn't happen because you weren't enough. It happened because they never learned how to receive something as whole as you. Let that be your healing, not silence, not waiting, not hoping they'll come around. Let your healing be this truth, burned into the bones of your self-worth. They didn't reject you. They rejected the love they believed they never deserved. There comes a moment when the silence grows louder than the pain. At first, it feels like a whisper in the dark. Then it becomes a voice, then a roar. And that voice isn't theirs, it's yours. For so long, you've been tuned to the frequency of someone else's suffering, hoping that if you loved hard enough, waited long enough, gave endlessly, they'd finally meet you halfway. But here, in this stillness, you realize something bone deep. The real story never began when they arrived. It begins now, when you turn around and walk back to yourself. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the sacred journey of returning to your whole self by integrating all the pieces you once split apart to be loved. As an empath, your gift has always been your ability to feel deeply, to notice what others miss, to soften when others harden. But that gift became a cage when it was only ever used to fix others. Now, for the first time, that empathy turns inward. Take the story of Maya, for example. A gentle, intuitive woman in her late 30s. Maya spent years loving a partner who never asked about her dreams, never stayed when things got hard, and never once apologized for the pain he caused. But she stayed because he'd once cried in front of her, and she believed that glimpse of vulnerability meant transformation was near. For 5 years, she waited for that man to become the version she believed he could be, until one night, after he walked out mid-argument and didn't return for 3 days, she sat alone in the quiet, and she realized he wasn't the problem anymore. Her hope was. Her loyalty to his potential had replaced her loyalty to herself. The next morning, she didn't beg him to change. She packed her things and left. That was the day she began to live her own life again. Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. For empaths, fate often looks like rescue missions dressed as relationships. But the truth is, many of the people you've tried to love weren't your soulmates. They were your teachers. They taught you where you still needed to be chosen, by yourself. The return to self isn't loud. It's not a fiery speech or a grand exit. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the day you stop apologizing for your needs. The hour you cancel the call that drains you. The moment you realize you don't owe anyone your light just because they're standing in darkness. It's choosing boundaries, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence for your own soul. This return is the opposite of abandonment. It's belonging. Not to them, to yourself. You begin to recognize how much energy you once spent trying to be understood by someone who didn't even understand themselves. And in that recognition, you reclaim your power, not because you hardened, but because you softened toward yourself. Individuation is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the mask, before the chase, before the belief that your love had to prove its worth through suffering. This journey doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you finally understand that your love is sacred and must be matched, not managed. In the end, this isn't about them. It never was. You loved deeply. You gave everything. But the real story begins not when they walk away, but when you walk back to yourself. This is the return Carl Jung spoke of. The full circle from illusion to truth, from projection to awareness, from self-abandonment to self-integration. Now, you see them clearly, not as your soulmate, but as your teacher. They taught you where you still craved approval, where you still believed love had to be earned, where your light would shrink just to stay in someone's darkness. But no more. You're not just an empath. You're a soul with depth, boundaries, and fire. And now you're learning to offer love only where it's met with respect. To stop feeding relationships that starve you. To stop confusing sacrifice with worth. This is not the end of your ability to love. It's the beginning of your ability to choose who gets to receive it. They didn't become who you hoped they would, but you became someone stronger than they ever imagined.